This, what I have to present to you today is called Cornered with Judith Berry. Um, I guess the subtitle is Having Been Taken, Having Been Made to Leave. Um, Basically, I have to begin with the customary apologies and disclaimers. These remarks are not, they're not going to make very much sense. And any sense they make is within the general assumption that the Atlantic slave trade and settler colonialism are the irreducible conditions of possibility of global modernity, i.e. of the very idea of the global and the very idea of modernity. And that these ideas include modernism, which is also to say postmodernism. But they also include or project this institution for good or ill. Not by that I mean the museum, but also this museum. And the entire structure of the proper, i.e. appropriation, expropriation, the appropriate, the inappropriate, the proper, the improper. And I should also say too that, well, both when I'm always thankful to be invited to speak in museums and with art historians and artists, but I never quite know why I'm why I'm here. But maybe I started. I think this particular show helped me to figure out maybe why I'm here. I should also say too that the particular way in which this stuff is not going to make sense is particularly annoying to me today, or mortifying, because I think it might give the impression that I'm speaking some kind of private language, and that's on the one hand, that's the last thing I want to do, because really what I want to do is sort of critique privacy. But then on the other hand, maybe that's just the best we can do. Is maybe instead of critiquing privacy, maybe the real point is to put ourselves into various positions where we can kind of just fail at privacy, or where privacy breaks down. So anyway, what I have to read here is sort of two versions of the same thing, I guess you could say. And one of them is maybe more of something like what a kind of a poet would do. And then one of them is something more like what some kind of a degraded scholar might do. Okay, so I'll read the poetry part first. In a corner, a coat hook for headphones to listen to the languages you don't have. Is listening to a language you don't have like looking at a face you don't have. I don't have Arabic or even know if it's Arabic, but there's a fuchsia circle around her face, and this crowdedness fades. Inshallah comes as a beautiful recognition without subject, then fade. My life is in front of me. What's in front of me when she says my life is in front of me, then fades? Sandy Hilal, is every plaza roofless? Is this an outdoor corner? Can this be an outlaw corner? This is about the difference between being in the corner and being on the corner. Image remains, but on the crushed stool in the gloss black ground, then turn to see my crushed stool in the low mirror of imagination dead imagine. Its field of quadratic or quadraphenic echo, to live the open corner. This choreographed or choreographed view, held in the corner by crowding blackness, objections glaze and favor, accidental ensemble. The digital fade is a loss of already lost color. Then there is a kind of wind in the image, a breath upon her face, unsettling it, moving it in stillness, in dark and shimmer, mixed in jammed varieties of effacement in composure, abjections gaze in flavor. Appropriation and institutional critique, the key word which links Johanna Burton and Darby English, and I'm speaking of the essays in the catalog, perhaps in spite of themselves, is articulation. On the one hand, at the corner where sight and work converge. On the other hand, good fences make good neighbors, so let the work reclaim itself in our descriptions. But setting curation aside, what if curacy is overcrowding and scarring? Blurred portrait, mugged mug shots, amputation and the range of echo it induces, spooky resonance, phantom hapticality. The demand that a conveyed thing convey, because an image is a thing, a thought, a word is a thing. This is a matter, the matter of poetics, contra weak theories and surface readings. The demand that a conveyed thing convey, because all things do is bear, carry, convey one another, is oppression to the one who would be free of every burden, the one who wants his artworks that way too. On the corner, as an articulate glossa murmur, which is an Anne Waldman lick, there might be another ethics of social support. The works care for, cure, cut plus heal, curate one another. Their para-ontological massage is contact improvisation. Rub my ears. Why headphones but not blinders? Why protect phonic integrity in accordance with all this transverse, anareflective blur? English speaks of putting stuff together. Perhaps this lets us speak more precisely of how stuff go together. Things go together in support of one another so thoroughly that the memory of the thing fades to black, nothing, in dry, exhausted wind. This is the strong theoretical deconstruction of the very idea of one and the very idea of another. Overcrowding, overflowing, my cup, but more precisely my plate. Too much of not enough, abundance of cuttings, informality and articulation overflown away. Black study, which is to say blackness, the preoccupied breath of the ones who have been taken, who have been made to leave, is the para-ontological study of things, of material, as they emerge from and fade into the nothingness of their sociality. As a context, Darby English writes, as a context, art gives things in relation a capacity to inform that no other framework can. How might it be possible to believe and enact what here remains obscure and unperformed? It's not about things it's not about things beside one another. It's about the very idea of the thing being beside itself in the radical hapticality of an absolute and informational nothingness, consent not to be a single being. Insofar as blackness is not just one name among others for this condition, and precisely to that extent, blackness is the subject of every artwork. So that's the first version. I don't know, whatever. And this is the second sort of more scholarly version. And it begins with two epigraphs from the Darby English essay, which is called Good Fences. Okay. The first is short and the second one is longer. First one, to demand that an image or thing convey people problems, that's a lot to ask of an image or thing. And the second, we could tell the stories of how these practices in another way, say by proposing a genealogy of appropriation and institutional critique that also writes the history of a shift in the valences of form construction. But such a history would need to leave a lot of room for aspects, even criteria of art, that the critique of institutions often seems quite eager to set aside. Another utterly defining element of what Wilson, Steinbach, and Williams, who are also in the show, had to do to create these works was the notably unfussy, differently intentional act of putting stuff together. You take something and sit it next to something else in order to pose, but not necessarily to answer a question about their relationship. You do this not because on its own it's a particularly interesting thing to do, but because as a context, art gives things in relation a capacity to inform that no other framework can. What becomes of analysis and interpretation when description, without which neither can proceed very far, foregrounds the relationship, the condition of besideness that is the sine qua non of critique made manifest as art. Is the experience of art a private experience? When English valorizes description, it seems as if he's saying no. Deeper still, normative art history, which English exemplifies and seeks to renew, is predicated not only on the essentiality of description, but also on what Paul Guyer, interpreting Kant, who Clement Greenberg, English's most elemental precursor, says is the first modernist, calls the intersubjective validity of judgments of taste. This supposedly intersubjective validity, which description confirms and enacts, is, I think, what Michael Fried calls conviction. The art historian's categorical imperative to assert that the work he judges to be great must be great for anybody. Of course, a vast range of brutal qualification determines who is understood to be anybody as opposed to nobody. But the issue on which I want to focus now concerns this problematic of intersubjectivity. I am concerned with how it is that intersubjectivity can and indeed must be aligned with the simultaneous privileges and privations, private transdescriptive experience, with how it is that English's invocation of Frost's oft-cited adage, Robert Frost, good fences make good neighbors, helps us to understand the intensity of the interplay between solipsism and the ordinary negation of sociality, the anti-sociality that might be said to undergird an experience of art that is simultaneously normative and impossible. The question of the privacy of the experience is all bound up with the question of the privacy of the work. Besideness implies discreteness, the separation whence springs the various beauties and uglinesses of articulation. I want to consider for a moment that besideness is anti-sociality masquerading as what it negates, that intersubjectivity is solipsism held and enacted within the immeasurable because non-existent free space of the public-private field. Just as anti-sociality masquerades as sociality, so description within normative art history is meant to stand in for and to instantiate the transdescriptive loneliness that ensues when anybody, in his abstract and exclusionary equivalence with anybody else, takes it upon himself to tell you what he sees, insofar as whatever it is that he sees is always only himself attempting to apprehend himself in the artwork as mirror. Meanwhile, it remains for us to consider the disappearance of things in relation into nothingness. Implied here is that we must or can use the language of things to get to nothingness in and as sociality. When English places thing and image in a quite particular association with one another, he does so against the grain of Wittgenstein's emphatic insistence on the difference between them and on the difference between the various grammars with which he would attend to them. And this is a transcription of some comments Wittgenstein made in a lecture course in 1937. We are tempted to use the grammar which we use for a word designating a physical object. We are tempted to use this grammar for words that designate impressions. In our primitive language, most substantives relate to some physical object or another. When, then, we begin to talk of impressions, we have a temptation to use the same kind of grammar. Our craving is to make the grammar of the sense datum similar to the grammar of the physical body. That was why the term sense datum was introduced, it being the private object corresponding to the public object. When Wittgenstein says also that, quote, it seems to people unavoidable to hypostasize a feeling, end quote, it tempts one to consider that the interplay between the artwork's form and the art historian's conviction that description is supposed to mediate is not only best characterized as hypostasization, but is also best understood as the necessarily failed structure of public-private rapprochement. The essentially impossible relation between things, in failed correspondence with the essentially impossible relation between antibodies, turns out to do its most important work in guarding the border, necessarily fictive, between antibodies, supposedly bound to one another by the intersubjective validity of their taste, and nobodies, held together in the fantastic and terrible hapticality of their flavor. Just as Wittgenstein recognizes the futility of wishing for some absolute separation of the grammars of sense datum and object, impression, image, and thing, it's probably futile for us to wish for some absolute separation of relational things and nothingness in or as sociality. Perhaps Mondrian was also teaching us this, more or less simultaneously with Wittgenstein, that it's okay to use the grammar of representation as long as you recognize the various problematics that attend that use. And above all, as long as you recognize not only that the operative relation is neither that between image and thing, nor that between thing and thing, but that between things and nothing. And that what's at stake is not held in the nexus of representationality in or as relationality, but in a certain haptical sociality which, in these incredibly cool ways, the experience of this show helps us to produce. The overwhelming Althusserian question concerns how and by what mechanisms we can move from production to discovery. How do we conceptualize this haptical sociality when we remain beholden to or held by the grammar of relation in or as representation? Another way to put it is that the Althusserian question allows us to move through an Althusserian problematic, or at least Althusser's oft-referenced way of thinking and valorizing articulation, articulated combination, his translation of Marx's particular inflection of and upon the German word Gliederung. I'm listening for an inarticulate murmur, the informal noise that attends informations and deformations, constant undoing of information. I'm trying to make this distinction, and it's not quite loud enough, between information with an E and information, and where information implies something like the production or the spewing out, maybe would be a better word, of form. Anyway, the relation between image and thing, given in the relation between image and viewer, is taken away, as it were, by what the viewer must recognize as the material thingliness of the image. Strangely, this rematerialization of the image, even in artworks that purport to be interested in and to instantiate the dematerialization of the object, is shut down when the viewer fails to recognize his thingly materiality in all of its hapticality. This is to say that the problem, again, isn't so much the interplay of reflection and representation. It is rather the displacement and suppression of an imaginary and temporary relation between things, viewer and artwork, by an imaginary and endless non-relation masquerading as relation between images. This is what arises when the viewer thinks of himself as form rather than as substance. Alas, English is unconcerned with relations between things either within the artwork or between the artwork and the viewer. He is concerned rather with the impossible relations that obtain between forms, that general field of antisociality that is best described, again, in the adage, good fences make good neighbors. The best neighbor is the one who remains unseen, insofar as to see him is to see yourself. Meanwhile, the concept of relations between things, even as it is inevitably and hopelessly lost in description's transdescriptive signal, might prepare us in its fictiveness for the haptical sociality that keeps on being instantiated on the corner with Judith Barry. And just to add one more thing, that if you heard the echo of Adrian Piper in these remarks, you know, it was because she was in there, but in a kind of deformed way. In this respect, that piece Cornered, which is also in the show, is kind of insistent in the way that it's always trying to get white people who view it to come to grips with a certain understanding of what she might call, of what she calls their blackness. And in a way, it's a kind of a blood quantum formulation there. But it's only that insofar as I think she's always gesturing towards some much more intense and deep understanding of what blackness actually constitutes, independent of the blood, let's say. And so one way to think about it is that those two experiences of the corner, one, you know, Adrian Piper's cornered, but the other literally being sitting there on those sort of, at least under my weight, collapsing stools, trying to watch Cairo Stories, that one Judith Barry piece, while what shows up insistently, not only as a kind of hulking, maximal, and at the same time also minimal presence, but what also literally shows up in the very images that we're supposed to be looking at in Cairo Stories is imagination, dead imagine. You're sitting there in a certain weird way, cornered, you know, by Judith Barry's other piece. And what you're also constantly seeing is this sort of amazing, beautiful, digitally induced fade to black that the faces of the women in the Cairo Stories is constantly undergoing. And I guess all I'm trying to say is the idea, I went to the museum to try to find the one work I was supposed to talk about. And I left the museum trying to formulate some new theory that would basically undermine the very idea of one work. And in this respect, the curation was beautiful. It was the overcrowding and was, for me, you know, I have a friend who had something in the show, and she was a little taken aback by what she thought to be the overcrowded sense of the way her piece was presented. And I came to believe that, and in a way it was as if the overcrowding was indexed to a kind of carelessness, but in my view, the overcrowding was actually an effect of great care. Anyway, thank you.